we'll start with that, and if you could say who you are, where you're from, and just what your, this presentation isn't about me just speaking, but it's about us talking about what we're doing, what we're learning, our hopes and our fears, and how we can help each other move through this deliberative approach and sharing what we're learning as we go. But definitely building on a very solid foundation around deliberation, not starting from scratch, because there has been a lot of work done related to this. So we need to recognize that there are resources we can pull together for this that already exist. We just need to adapt them for impact. And there's a lot of the work that I've done in the past is around organizational learning and knowledge mobilization. And one of the theories of adult learning that we base a lot of what we do on is that people, it's called the 70-20-10 rule of adult learning, in that 10% of what we learn and sticks with us and we use comes from more formal learning, like classroom learning, professional training, and that sort of thing. 20% comes from doing work with others and getting feedback as we go. So I use the example of performance appraisals that we may do with folks, or ongoing feedback loops that we might build in when we're doing a project together. And actually 70% of what we learn, what sticks, and what we continue to use comes from experience, from actually starting to do something, rolling up our sleeves with others and putting that in play. So while we will have resources available related to all of this on the Partage site, and we have a fair bit already in the implementation guide, the biggest and most valuable way to learn is by actually starting to describe what it is we do, as I can see people are doing both in Australia, in Sydney and East Melbourne, in terms of your planning documents, and begin to get our heads around that, but also through conversation with others. So with that being said, and that being the foundation of the way we're doing this work, I'll move on. Again, if you have any comments throughout this presentation, please, and you don't want to necessarily interrupt by interjecting verbally, put what you want to say into the chat box, and I'll pay attention to that and go from there. I think Jeannie might be having some connection issues. Are you there, Jeannie?
I'm back. I'm just on my iPhone.
Oh, okay. You're in transit. The end of the day. So this, I think with a project as big as Impact, where we have 6 sites, and I could only find an image with 4 puzzle pieces that was a nice image, but we actually have 6 lips pulling all of these puzzle pieces together, and in some cases we're actually building the puzzle piece as we go, and so it really emphasizes the need for ongoing communication like this and learning together, so that we do it well and are all heading in the same direction and hopefully building the same puzzle. Won't advance just a sec. There. So I'm going to do a brief overview of core principles related to deliberative processes, our general approach, talk about the example from Ontario, which Simone has been very kind to help build and help us learn from, and talk about a few resources and templates, hopefully have a good chunk of time for conversation at the end. So these are core principles or general guidelines. You might call them general guidelines as well, but not rules. The key thing is, I think that we are engaged in Impact in a participatory and very collaborative project, and we have to be very cautious about not defaulting to deliberation for every decision that needs to be made. There are times when in our lips and in the work that we do, we just need to be making administrative, managerial type decisions, The deliberative process is really for those big decisions where we have different perspectives coming to bear, and we recognize that we need to fully engage diverse stakeholders who might have different perspectives and values about decisions in that decision-making process. So within impact, and I've seen this in a couple of the documents that Sam sent, we're not necessarily, depending on what the data shows in different communities, we're not necessarily deliberating about a population, a specific population that we will focus on, but we are anticipating that we will have to deliberate with community stakeholders around access priorities within an area, and an access priority in accordance with the framework that we're using might be something related to affordability. It might be related to ability to pay. It might be something as general as that, and I'll point to some resources to help with those definitions at the end. And those access priorities may cut across a couple of populations, meet the needs of a couple of populations. So we want to be cautious about, in our community context, what do we really need to make decisions about based on the available data and the stage that the community is at in moving some of these things forward. We need to provide clear choices and allow voice for differing values and perspectives so that when we do make a decision, we've taken all of that into account. We also need to, in our facilitation, choose the right approach, facilitated approach for the context and the purpose of deliberation. So there's more than one way to facilitate this, and I think that that in some ways is a bit frightening, but it also means that we can really tailor the way that we facilitate a given deliberative process to the context and the purpose of deliberation. And we will work together with people to make sure that, I know in some contexts you have really skilled facilitators already in place, and they likely can help to determine what's best for which context. And we do have, as I mentioned before, some key resources in the LIP implementation guide, the managing data guide or a measurement guide, I'm not sure what that one's called, and also on Partage there are resources there that we are growing as we go. And an intent or a core principle about the deliberative process is that it is quite collaborative, participatory. It is a way in which we hope to engage community, but also our research stakeholders more broadly in the LIPs. And it's also a way for us to learn about what might work and what won't in a given context. Also fundamental to doing this well, planning, preparation, and experience facilitation. There may be some other principles that we can talk about, those that you may think of that may help you to move forward where you are, but we'll just move on at this point. So I will go to the Partage sites where you can see the current version of the LIP implementation guide in just a few minutes, but in that guide we talk about some general features of the approach or components of the approach, and they involve identifying the collective decision that needs to be made and really framing the questions that we're asking in the forum quite clearly. And you'll see from the example in Ontario the importance of that. Identifying the stakeholders who will be peers in decision making, and that peers in decision making is also quite an important point. Because we're working specifically looking at vulnerable populations, we need to be very cognizant of power differences in a forum, and the facilitator needs to be quite aware of how he or she ensures that everyone has an equal voice in providing their perspective and identifying how their values may come to bear on a given option that's being presented in the decision-making process. So leveling the playing field so that everybody has a voice and everybody listens to what's being said is really, really important. So identifying those stakeholders becomes quite important. And we're also identifying and preparing background materials. Also from the Ontario example, they did extensive work in providing background materials and provided a lot of background materials. But I think a key lesson that we'll talk about is not overwhelming people with information that they may not actually need to make an informed decision, but really targeting that information and not necessarily opening up the box to having more information come in, too much more information coming in during the form, but being really well prepared with those background materials. And also facilitating, as I said, so that people are listening and reaching a collective decision. And that goes back to that facilitation that's fit for the purpose and the context. And also for impact and for the LIPs, across the LIPs, facilitating learning about what we've done already and what has worked and what hasn't, which is what this session's partially about too. So this is, and I don't know, Melanie, did this go out before? I know it's quite small for people. We will have this PowerPoint available. And
I don't think it went
out
through before.
It just briefly. Go ahead, Melanie.
I don't think it went out before, sorry.
Okay, yeah, because it was a work in progress right up until the final minute. So we can make sure you get this, and to aid the discussion here, I'll just read through it a little bit, but hit on the highlights. So in Ontario, Simone pulled together over a few months preparing for a deliberative forum that they held in June. And what she and I did in debriefing after it was she provided a description of what they'd actually done. And they're on Partage, as I'll show you soon. There are many documents that they used in preparation for this forum that really gave a really solid overview of the data they'd gathered for the community needs assessment and consultations. So the pieces in blue here are the pieces that she provided in terms of description. The text boxes at the bottom are sort of a comment on each of those parts of the process. So starting on the left with consultations, in Ontario they had very strong pre-existing partnership with decision makers and primary care providers in the region of focus. That group had existed for some time with a general focus on planning and decision making within this particular local health innovation network, I believe LIN is called. But one of the things that in discussing the consultations, it was primarily with that pre-existing group members, not necessarily with new members. And in Ontario, the core team, one of the things that we talk about within each of the LIPs, having a core team, was very small. It was actually, I think, 4 people, again, from that pre-existing group. It wasn't, while it was coming together to talk about impact, it was still people were coming from that broader mandate of planning within the region. So we talked about a need to sort of reset that core team, which Simone is doing now, so that it has a specific focus on impact, and that's made very, very clear, but also so that they make sure that they have at the table not just health care providers and healthcare decision makers, but a broader community representation with the intent of having also someone representing vulnerable population or populations on the LIP core team to keep in touch with that specific focus of impact. That consultations, as I said, was also with that very broad network which existed prior to impact, and in hindsight we've recognized that it needs somewhat to be refocused and not necessarily perhaps reconstituted with some new members on it, so that it brings in some fresh eyes that aren't specifically there from the broad LIN planning perspective. I'll just stop there. Are there any questions so far? No. And Melanie, I can't see time as it's, I've got the screen this way, so let me know when I'm definitely verging on the half done in our time slot.
You're about halfway done, Cathie.
Okay, thanks. Good time check. So what happened in Ontario too was they did an initial data capture, which was very, very extensive. They performed gap analyses using health administrative data, and as you'll see on Partage, a lot of documents generated related to that. They used multiple sources of data. They had conversations with many people in that broad stakeholder group. So there isn't a lot of things that we can find there that may have resulted in not necessarily being able to reach the goal at the deliberative forum. The invitation to participate was sent out to invitees, again, in that same stakeholder group. They'd already been engaged in the broader planning, and they were largely professionals, so not a lot of community agency folk there. And in that invitation, the broad objective for the forum was stated, but it didn't say a lot about what the process would be at the forum. It didn't say a lot about or even articulate a more specific decision that would be made at the forum, other than, as we see in the next text box, informing priority identification of priority issues for impact or for this work. So again, it's that clarity of communication and preparation that are crucial. So what was sent out in the pre-forum data capture and sharing, they did, in addition to that needs analysis that they did, they also did a survey and got responses from people, which was an excellent way to gather data. They analyzed it and organized it under the summary of the survey response, where it did fall out that there were some key potential access issues for people that are living in rural communities, people with low income, people with mental health issues. But it, as you'll see in the deliberative forum itself, the way in which it was facilitated perhaps did not make it clear that there was already, from all of the data collected, some options, clear options on which a decision could be based. So when it came to the forum, again, a lot of wonderful work done in providing a lot of documentation, and in hindsight perhaps a bit too much documentation, a bit too much specifically related to the data. And so it was in a way too much for people to grapple with at the time. And starting with the description of the participants, again, it was the existing network, and it was really physician heavy. There were something like over 60% of participants were physicians, whereas you'd hope for a forum to have a little bit more diversity in representation, especially given these issues that we're talking about. The objective or the question was framed really broadly, not specifically, so there wasn't a clear question that people were answering, and there weren't clear options, even though out of the data some clear options had emerged. Because things were framed somewhat loosely and perhaps people weren't clear about what the process was in coming there, that the intent was to reach a decision. The participants continued in their discussion to add more perspectives to the summaries and weren't able to land on a decision related to access priority or priorities. So just a sec. So I'm just going to go to Partage now to show you some of the resources that are available. Pull it over here and make it bigger. So is there anyone that hasn't been on the Partage site yet? And you can just type in the chat box. Who is that? Sorry?
Well, Diana I haven't been at Portage.
Okay. And I know Sam and Sarah are working to get everybody on there, and we'll be doing some facilitation with it. So you'll get a general overview here. So this is my, as you can see, I'm logged in. So these are the committees that I'm involved with. So I can go to each one of those and get specific information. There's also a public place where all of us will be able to go and find documents. And at some point we'll be able to have our specific calendars, and each LIP will have, so here, if I go back to my home, my Alberta LIP will have a site where we can plunk documents, and our core team will all be able to go there to find documents so we can facilitate document sharing and make sure everybody's using the latest version of things. So in the documents place, you will see that there are tools for using Partage. We've got publications and presentations that have been done, and we're going to focus specifically on the impact tools and guides at this point. So this is documents for deliberative forums, and I'll just open this up. There's some documents being plunked here, and I think they may be the ones that I've seen both from Southeast Melbourne and Sydney. But as I mentioned, this zip folder holds all of the current documents related to the Ontario LIP, the one that I've just given you the overview of. So they're there, and I want to go one folder up, please. Go back here, documents. So impact tools and guides. This is deliberative forum, tools and guides, LIP tools and supporting documents. So here you have the LIP measures toolkit, which I won't go into now, the LIP implementation guide, and this is the most recent version of the guide, which will soon be updated. Sarah's madly working on that, I think, before she goes. And full Monash ethics application to use as an example. Hopefully we're all well along on that. And something that's being developed is our developmental evaluation. So in the LIP implementation guide, I'll show you a couple of things that are there. So this is Partage, and I'll just take this over here for now. So the guide is there. It provides you with an overview. I'll show you a checklist, and there are references for further reading. And we will continue to grow the implementation guide with key documents as we go, so you'll find them always there for each of the LIPs to follow along with. We also have some deliberative forum overviews, which will be of value to all of the LIPs. There's some differences between them, and we may not get time to talk about those differences right now, but as we go along, we will begin to try and harmonize as much as possible, for example, the statement of purpose for the forums and the background work that we do for the forums and so on. Also, Southeast Melbourne and Quebec have developed storyboards for their deliberative forums, so it's a planning or a running sheet that will have readily available for everybody to use. And this NCDD is a document, again, that's available will be available on Portage, and we can make available immediately if it's not there. That it gives an overview of many different ways in which to facilitate depending on the purpose. And purposes can range from decision making and taking collaborative action to resolving conflict and those sorts of things. So there's lots of options for facilitation that we can draw from. I've just plugged this in here because I think it's important for us always to touch on this this diagram, which many of you have seen in the past, the 6 lips in the center with the projects that are happening alongside the evolution of the local innovation partnerships. Project 1, the scoping of innovations, which will be used to inform the deliberative forums. So a deliberative forum around identifying the interventions or innovations that will be used in each LIP will be informed by what's learned from this Project 1 and also to a certain extent Project 2 in terms of how effective certain innovations are and how they've been implemented. I also wanted to draw your attention to this, which is also in the LIP implementation guide, but it gives you a general overview of the timelines for things that are LIP-centered activities and those, similar to this circle, those research projects. So we're doing things much the same time here, both within the LIPs and within the projects, cross-program research activities, which is why it is so important that we talk often and have sessions like this so that we ensure that what's being learned from the projects is informing the LIPs and what's happening with the LIPs continues to inform the projects. And as you can see, we're 2014 and 15. Some of the things that are LIP-centered activities are identification and selection of access problems and organizational innovations, hence the deliberative forums happening sort of in sync with what we're learning from Project 1. Also in the guide is this deliberative process checklist, which teases out the key components of a deliberative process, the things that need to be done, and materials that you might need to have generated in order to move the deliberative process forward. This is an example of the running sheet or storyboard that's being used in Southeast Melbourne for planning for their deliberative process. So it's quite detailed, and what it is a minute-by-minute almost plan for what will be done during the forum. And again, no need to recreate the wheel on here. We'll fine-tune it, make sure that it's got everything it needs, and it is very comprehensive. Where we may differ is when we look at how the conversations are facilitated, and I think needs to be some tailoring of that to the people who are identified as stakeholders and how that's done with your very experienced facilitator. This is so one way to facilitate prioritization if you have clear choices. So this is an example of using a mix of a multi-voting process where you have a couple of rounds of votes with the problems having been clearly articulated, followed by using a prioritization matrix called an impact/investment matrix, which I'll show you in a second, and then potentially re-voting depending on what comes out of that prioritization matrix. So this is the impact investment matrix. You can see what you might do after you've done 2 rounds of voting, for example, on access priorities, is then get people to take the ones that remain have been voted highest priority, and then organize them according to the level of impact people believe that priority could have on vulnerable populations' access to care needs, and the amount of effort required or resources required to take it on. And as you can see, this quick win is where it would have a high impact and be somewhat low effort. This other is high impact but requires more effort. And I think the suggestion here is that things that make this cutoff would then be put back into the pile for the next round of voting. Things that are here and we clearly understand that it will maybe not have a great impact based on certain criteria that we'd have to set and would require high effort, would not necessarily make the next round of voting. This last slide here is just this conversation about deliberative processes is just one piece of the puzzle, and as you can see from how I've described it, we're still actually building that puzzle piece around deliberation across the 6 lips. But as we move forward, we intend to have a very solid puzzle piece around deliberation, very clear for all of us, and recognize that we need to support each other to get there with that level of clarity. And if you need help, Sam and Sarah are our 2 international coordinators or national coordinators. They will be available to support you and answer your questions. Having said that, I think they're both going on holiday in the next little while. So Sarah's away. I'm just having to go to this smaller version. Sam's away September 3rd to 11th, so she's back next week. Sarah is winging away on Thursday until the 24th. But when they're not around, others of us, like the principal investigators, are around to help. So I'm going to stop there and just see if there are questions, comments, or specific things you'd like to discuss further.
Hi, it's Amy here from Sydney. I had a question about, it's probably more about Ontario's experience with how they provided a whole lot of information up front and found that people just got bogged down in just the level of detail. I guess, how could that be done differently? So we have a series of about 5 story sheets that are probably 1 to 2 or 2 or 3 pages each. Yes. And I think that is kind of the same thing that Ontario had. It's quite a big document.
Well, yes, I think it's all to do, Amy, with partly it's tied also to framing the question and being clear about the process. So I think from what I've read in terms of what you have planned for the documentation, which is the stories, and I'm just trying to find it here because I've got it beside me, the stories and the, over on the other side, let's see, the access stories, the consent form, the access diagram, and 1-page plain language summary. That's East Melbourne, but yours is somewhat similar. I think that just even there is less than what was sent out with Ontario. So I'm just going to go back to Partage and go back to sorry, documents, PEC tools and guides, deliberative forms. Okay, so I'm not sure it's here. Oh. But they sent out a large number of the more, they weren't raw because they were analyzed, but more detailed data summaries. So if you look here, this is what was sent out. A large number of things. So all of these indicators, not the statement, well, it was, and definitions document, the evaluation form. So people got a lot of things in an email, and I think that it was perhaps hard for people to determine what to focus on in preparation for the forum. As we know with busy people, the easier we can make the reading material, the more plain language we can make it if we've got diverse populations, the more targeted the explanation of what's needed to be done, both before and during the forum, the better off we'll be. And from what I'm seeing in both of your descriptions of the deliberative forum, you're well on the way to doing it in a very targeted way. Does that help, Amy?
Yeah, that does help. And it was really helpful to see the debrief that Ontario shared. I'm really glad that they did share that.
Yes, yeah.
So thank you on the line.
Yes, I actually don't know if anyone from Ontario, I thought Simone would be here, but I don't see her. The other Simone. So, any other questions? And I might go around and just get your thoughts, even if you don't have questions formed at this point. And if there aren't any specific questions.
I have a question, Cathie, and it has to do with how much, you know, like we're trying to learn facilitation at the same time that we're doing this. So we're on this learning curve, and I just wondered if you had any kind of advice about how we can have authority in what we're doing and sort of running the process so that people have enough security that we know what we're doing, at the same time that we're kind of being open about the fact that we're learning. And so do you have any advice about that? And that we're, anyway, go ahead. We're not using,
well, I think, yeah. Yeah, is having just one of the keys. There are many keys. There's no single key. But I think this running sheet / storyboard is vital. And this is actually just the outline of the day. But I guess what I'm trying to say is the planning and the practice that goes into facilitating before. So not just putting it on paper and assuming it's going to work, but actually having some dry runs in terms of, and actually talking through the facilitation strategy if you haven't used it much before. The key thing to remember, or something to remember, I'll stop using the word key pretty soon, but one thing to remember is that when you do actually have a forum where you've invited a number of people, the resources that people are putting into getting there really mean that we need to be very well prepared. So if we can, on the impact team, provide each other with a sounding board to try out the idea that you're going to use for your facilitation, just problem solve around it. If you can find locally a few people who may not, who may be more like the public or the stakeholders that are coming to your meeting, to just run through the description of what you're doing. It's like any presentation you do. You don't just put it on a PowerPoint slide and expect that when you get up and stand up in front of a large number of people, it's going to come off well unless you've practiced it. And these forums need to be practiced prior. So in terms of authority, I think having that practice will help, Jeannie. I think getting feedback on really describing who you've got there, what facilitation strategy you're planning to use, and talking through who, even to the point where you've got your PowerPoint ready for the parts of it where you'll be talking, and you talk that through with somebody else would be important. Does that help, Jeannie, or did I miss the mark on that question?
That's very helpful. Very helpful. Thank you.
Yeah. So, Diana, any questions from you?
No, actually, I had the same as Jenny. I'm a bit, you know, cannot say scared, but a bit nervous about the facilitation process. And that's
yeah. Yeah, and this is, I just wonder from folks on the line, have you all got or contracted? I think South Melbourne has contracted a facilitator, someone who has a lot of experience facilitating, but I don't think that's the case with everybody. Is that true?
We have for Sydney, and then anyway, Amy maybe can tell more, but we have also experienced, facilitator, but that's for the second forum, but for the first one, yeah.
Okay.
This is Simone from South Australia. We've actually been fortunate enough to meet with the South East Melbourne facilitator while South East Melbourne were discussing their deliberative forums. So we've actually been involved in their process a little bit, and we're also intending on going over for their deliberative forum later this month. So we're hoping, I guess as you were saying, 70% is experience. So being over there, we're hoping to again glean a lot of information and learnings from the day, and also potentially bring over the facilitator for our deliberative forum in early November.
Okay, that's excellent. So that means all of the Australian LIPs will be using some experienced facilitators. I think too, an important thing, even if the facilitator is experienced, and I think in Australia the case is that those facilitators have been working in the area of primary health care before, the work that you as coordinators and leads in the LIPs do with them prior to the forum is vital in terms of giving them context, and someone can have phenomenal facilitation skills but not have done deliberative facilitation before, and so it's very, very important that this key point of needing to make a decision is embedded within the way they facilitate and the strategies they use for the audience, that it really permeates every aspect of what you do in the planning. Because I think having a lot of information, while that's important, it isn't necessarily something that's going to lead you to a decision in the end. And it goes back to that principle of adult learning, again, that you can have a lot of formal documentation or formal training, but it's getting, having a robust discussion about the perspectives and the values attached to each of the decision options really does influence your ability to get to the decision. So the work that you do in gathering the data in preparing people before they get to the forum for what's actually going to happen there is all just as important as what you do on the day. So that was Simone. I'm just looking. Melanie, Anne, anything from Quebec and your thoughts? I know you're getting ready for this too.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if we'll be using an experienced facilitator just because we, resource-wise, we might. Yeah. We were talking about maybe if we could find somebody who would give us their services. Maybe we're talking about that with Sarah this afternoon. But I sent you a few emails about this over the week. But so we're thinking we might use more of a prioritization strategy where we would have more of maybe a paper trail of how we got to the decision. Just because it looks like maybe not everybody that we want there will be able to be there, and we would like to go validate our decision with some key stakeholders after the decision's been made. So we're thinking maybe more of a prioritization with a matrix would be an interesting way to have that rigor and that paper trail that we can send out to our partners after.
Mm-hmm. And so I think in terms of our ability to compare lip to lip what happens, having as many things the same as possible in terms of the types of information and that sort of thing. But this issue of being able to get everybody in one room is a really interesting one in terms of the strategies that we might use for ensuring that the perspectives have been heard and that the decision is made and informed by all of the perspectives. So for example, if what you do at the session where you've got a lot of people but not everybody narrows it down to a few priorities, you want to make sure that the people who aren't there also get to speak to all of the options as well, so that they're not just having to respond to a narrowed set of priorities. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does.
Because the idea is that if their perspectives are valuable and somewhat different, that they're important for sifting through all of the options, not just a reduced number. So that means that it may be that even prior to the session you might want to do some deliberative polling so that everybody's had a chance to look at the broader set of options and give some input on them. Just one thought as you're mentioning that.
All right.
We too in Alberta won't have funds for an experienced facilitator. We'll be able to help with it, but we're also talking about whether some of the in-kind, there are experienced facilitators in the community who are working in primary health care, so could that be something that the community contributes as opposed to the research funding? So similar option for us too.
Thank
now,
you.
is there somebody new on the line? Oh, go ahead, Jeannie.
No, I just have to leave, so I thank you very much. This was extremely helpful, and I wanted to thank you for doing it.
Oh, no problem. I guess we've got 4 minutes. I know you have to go. In terms of what people would find helpful going forward, this will be made available through Sarah and Sam on Partage, I'm sure. They're taping this session, or I believe you have been. Yes, that right down at the bottom it says this session is being recorded. So it'll be available to listen to again. But in terms of next steps, when you think of yourself, Diana and Amy, I think of you and Sydney or Simone launching into your deliberative forum, would another session like this where maybe you're a little bit closer to having the plans in place where we just brainstorm or discuss what you've got in place, would something like that be helpful? What sorts of things can we do to help?
I think I actually really need to have a good look on Partage. We've got a lot of resources on Basecamp, which I think is shared with the other Australian LIPs.
Yeah.
So I think I really need to log on there and have a look and see what resources are there already that can be of use to us.
Yes. Yeah, I think I think what I'm finding too is that in each LIP we start to save things. This becomes more and more important the busier we get, to have one source of truth in a sense, but to have one place where we know we'll get the latest documents, and we know we'll be able to look at a calendar for capacity building things and know when sessions are. My email, if it's like yours, is just, I've got a lot of things in addition to impact in it, and so sometimes I'm not really on top of which documents which, and so I'm really looking forward to having this one place to go. Partage will be an enormous resource for all of us to go to. Anyone else in terms of things that might be helpful? And feel free just to type into the chat box too if